Hello, listeners. My name is Dr. Eric Tornfelt, and this is the Thriving Schoolhouse Podcast. I want to welcome all of my listeners today, and thank you so much for tuning in. This is the first episode of the Thriving Schoolhouse Podcast. The podcast is produced in collaboration with New Era Superintendents and the work that they are doing to do whatever it takes to help superintendents across the country improve student achievement for students in reading and math. The purpose of this podcast is to create the space and to create the conversations for people in education about what it really is going to take to move the needle for our education system here in the United States. In 2022, I wrote a book called The Crumbling Schoolhouse, A Candid View of American Education. And in my book, I shared a lot of different thoughts that I had of over 20 years of experience working in schools. And I brought up issues that many people either disagreed with, or they said, Eric, you are talking about things that everybody knows but doesn't want to say it. And I talked about the importance of male leadership, specifically dads in the home. I talked about issues like sexuality in schools, the hidden politics of schools. And after writing that book, I decided that I wanted to continue that work. And in partnership again with New Era Superintendents and Matt Kinnaman, I have started this podcast with the purpose of continuing these conversations and to really help add thought leadership to the field of K-12 education and to help others really be honest about what is actually happening in our schools today. And in light of what's actually happening, how do we actually fix it? And what are the things that we need to be thinking about and talking about? And what are the things that are going to help truly move the needle foundationally for our schools, but ultimately that will help move the needle for students and their achievement, specifically in reading and math. As I have these conversations, I hope that you'll enjoy them. I hope you'll find them stimulating. I always want to have all of my conversations also with specific students in mind. I have students that don't know how to read, that don't know how to write, and they may be in 7th or 8th grade and they still don't have some of those foundational skills. And so as we talk about these things, there's real people, real students at the other end of these ideas and these conversations. And that's why I want to have other thought leaders on this podcast to help contribute to this work, to drive this work. And I also hope for those that are not involved in education, that are just tuning in, that you would be able to listen, to educate yourself, and to think about what is your role, or what are opportunities for you to get involved in helping improve achievement for all students. Because when all students achieve, we're going to have a better society. We are going to have more informed citizens. We are going to have people that are committed to making our communities better. And those are all important things. And so it's important that we have strong schools so that we can have strong communities, and that we can have strong communities for future generations. Today, our guest on our podcast is Dr. Matthew Younis, and I'm excited about having Dr. Younis as our first guest of the Thriving Schoolhouse Podcast, because Dr. Younis really has done a lot of great work for many years in his home district of Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools. He is an assistant principal. I worked with Dr. Younis. We were part of an Inspiring Leaders program together and have spent some time together. But he provides a unique perspective on the role that he has as an assistant principal in his district, and provides us some just thoughts about what does it look like to be a leader in his district, but also what does it look like for, I like what he says in this episode about superintendents, and if a new superintendent were to come into his district, what should they be doing? And so I hope that you enjoy this episode with Dr. Matthew Younis. Thank you. Dr. Younis, thank you for being here today. We really appreciate you being on the podcast. tell us just a little bit about your background. What kind of schools have you worked in? And what's your current role? And what do you enjoy in your current role?
Excellent. Well, thank you, Dr. Thornfeld. I appreciate it. I have 20 plus years in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools, teaching and as an administrator, both the dean and assistant principal. And I've done a little bit of everything. I've done middle school. I've done IB middle school, traditional middle school. I've done Title I middle school. I've done a magnet alternative high school. And predominantly, I've done elementary education. So that was where I taught, and that's where I've been for the past several years as an assistant principal. And I've had a great experience, and again, seen a lot of things. I think for me, the biggest joy, and maybe why I connect to the elementary school kids, is feel like you're getting in there when they're young enough to make a big impact on their lives and really planting those seeds. Again, one of the disappointing parts is that you don't always see where they go, but that ability to kind of plant those seeds, make those relationships with kids early on, and have that positive connection with kids, and hopefully be that person or one of those people who really kind of project going forward in students' lives and can make connections for the kids to the positives of education and where it can take them.
That's great, Dr. Younis. Thank you for just kind of that introduction. I know that with every guest that's going to be on this podcast, there's going to be things that maybe listeners don't know about the guest. Is there maybe something about you, before we get into all the education talk, and is there something about you that maybe our listeners won't know unless you told them?
Something about me, I don't know. One thing I always point out is that I'm the youngest of 12 kids, which I think currently is very odd. It's not really so much a credit to me, but my parents. But I do think, part of growing up in a large family and those pieces, I think, play a role in kind of why I got into education. My oldest sister was an educator. One of my brothers was in education before. And so I think just that exposure to being around a lot of people and then having lots of nieces and nephews when I was young, I think that was a piece of kind of how I got into education, and just being around a lot of people and seeing the importance of connections and relationships. So it's not really me; it's really a credit to my parents having the 12 kids, but it is kind of unusual, and I don't think you get too many people these days who come from such a big family.
Wow, 12 kids. That's a schoolhouse right there.
And I'm the baby, so
that's impressive. So you had to learn how to stand up for yourself, for sure.
But then they kind of look out for you outside of the house too. So the positive piece, the pros and cons of the big family sometimes.
Wow, that's fantastic. So when you think about education, you think about your current role, it's easy, I think, especially when you're in school leadership, to focus a lot on doing discipline, putting out fires, kind of doing the things that are a grind for administrators. But you obviously you have your doctorate, you've done a lot of things. At this point in your career, what do you see as your contribution to the field of education? Like, what are you feel like you're giving your schoolhouse or to your district or your state right now that is unique and maybe a little bit different than another administrator at another building in your district?
Well, thanks. That's a great question. I don't know that I would say it's something amazingly unique. I think for me, it's really about supporting students and supporting teachers in order to give them the tools to really be their best selves. And sometimes that can look like a variety of things. And I think one thing I find that I'm pretty decent at is just, depending on the situation, being able to kind of adjust and being kind of what a person needs me to be in that moment. So being firm and consistent, being humorous, really having a balance where I want people to feel safe and I want people to really have their opportunities to be their best selves. And so that's my job, I think, in part as an administrator, is to create an environment where people feel safe, feel safe taking learning risks, both as educators and as students. And again, that idea of being like the lead educator as teachers in the classroom and being that model. And so creating that environment where teachers don't feel like they have to do everything right all the time, that they can't take risks. And so that way kids can learn that they can take risks and make mistakes and then learn from those mistakes. So I don't know if that's radical or not, but I just think it's an important thing in education that we really support our teachers and our staff, and really trying to make them feel comfortable and safe and take those risks to better themselves overall for the betterment of their students, and so that students are then doing the same.
So as a follow-up question to that, as we are starting the summer, this episode is being recorded on June 12th. There's going to be changes and turnover, and maybe teachers come in and say, I don't want to be a teacher anymore. Or they say that they're moving or they're doing something else. And you think about supporting your teachers. Is recruiting and retaining quality teachers, has that been a challenge for you in your current role, or has it been? And what are some kind of lessons learned in that area as you've progressed in your career?
So I'll say this, fortunately, in my current situation, we have very limited turnover. We have very high retention. And I think some of that is to that idea of like a supporting relationship. We also have a lot of fun when we can. And my current principal does a great job of really leading that and allowing us times to, whether it's like superhero days and just lots of fun theme days, we work together to eat a lot. So really try to like have kind of potlucks at lunch randomly and bringing things in. So little things like that for staff morale, and also to make it where we know this is a place of high expectations, but a place where, again, the adults, the administrators are going to have fun and try to make it fun for the kids as part of what they're doing. So I think that really helps overall with that morale piece and making people feel cared for beyond just that grind and trying to build those relationships with people, which I think is important. I've been in other schools, and again, not as consistently, where we've had more challenges. And I think that investment in people is probably the key. Getting new teachers in, pairing them with the right leaders in the school, the other teacher leaders, and then also making sure that you as an administrator are available for them and supporting them, giving them feedback, giving them coaching and support. But I think it's probably some of the things that, as I reflect back on when we've had more challenges, when we've had more success. But currently where I am, we really do just a great job of trying to celebrate our staff and our students and have fun. I think that minimizes some of our turnover. We have great students. We have great parent support too. So that additionally helps that kind of globally with that minimizing turnover at our school.
Do you, that the current, there's a lot that's been talked about right now with teacher shortages. And do you think that we are going to see changes in any of that? Or do you think that recruiting and retaining high quality teachers is going to continue to be an issue in your state or in our country?
I think it is. Currently, right, and the factors that go into it as far as, those initial factors, money is an initial factor, right? It is not necessarily a long-term piece, but if you're trying to recruit people, you're trying to get out and get some of the best people, you're coming out of college with a lot of debt and things like that, being able to entice people with pay. And yes, teacher pay overall has improved throughout the years, but still not on par with a lot of places. And people don't go into education to get rich. But we also have to make sure that we're providing something where teachers can make, a livable wage and not feel like they have to have a second or third job. Now, again, some people like to do some things, little side hustles, to do their own thing, which is great. But a lot of times it's feeling like with younger teachers and with the cost of, mortgages and the cost of apartments, teachers need a second or third job. I had a friend years ago who moved to California as a superintendent, and one of the challenges he said, because of where they were, was the teachers couldn't afford to live in the district on their pay, and so they were having to commute extremely far. Some of them maybe lived, and again, this was a fairly affluent area in general. Some of them lived maybe in the guest houses of some of the families and the parents, but it makes that difficult. From there, it's going to be that importance of, those new teachers supporting them and letting them know realistically what is happening, telling them the truth about the challenges that they will face, but then pairing them with good teachers. And then as leaders, really giving them that feedback and that support and modeling for them what the expectations are in order for them to have the best chance to grow with the students. And I think that's going to be our best bet, but it's not easy. It's going to constantly be growing. So do I think that there's suddenly not going to be an issue? No, but I mean, I feel like probably since before I was teaching, we've heard constantly of teacher shortages and struggles with retention. And this, again, I think, sometimes the idea, leads to the stress in the field too, right? People constantly feel it, whether it's there or whether it's just being said. But then also if we're increasing class size, we're increasing the expectations of what staff are supposed to do. Again, probably not the best pay in the world. It does make it difficult. I think tapping into teachers, though, as they grow too, and really highlighting their strengths and giving the opportunities to be teacher leaders, not necessarily administrators. So I think that's a challenge too, is that a lot of times people feel like the only way to grow in education is to continue to become an administrator, which is a great opportunity, but it's not the only thing. So how do we leverage teacher leaders, and how do we potentially offer them additional pay within that, responsibility, and adding those responsibilities to make them feel like they can grow, but still be in the classroom and still lead teachers without necessarily having to become an administrator.
Yeah. Yeah, because that seems to always be the case for folks is they want to stay in education, right? And the only viable way to do that, to support a family and stay in it, is to go and do it in leadership. But that's a very different skill set or realize either, right? And that could be the topic of one of our future podcasts.
For sure.
One of, so that's a great segue to what you're talking about with, a lot of people will share that problems with education, teachers don't get paid enough, there's discipline issues, student behaviors. There's always something for our communities to complain about with public education. And so I think many agree that in order to solve that, we've got to find innovative solutions to, teacher recruitment and retention, but also to other issues. And so my next question for you is, what is maybe one innovation or one creative idea that is not happening in education, or maybe it's happening in a very limited way, that you think would be very helpful and would truly be innovative and would grow the field of education in a positive way? What's one innovative idea that you think is important?
So I'm going to go back a tiny bit on what you said about like how people feel about education. This is both innovative, probably an area of growth, and then I'll talk more specifically too about the idea of like, the perspective, the public perspective of public education, and generally is not overwhelmingly positive. One of the things you find, or researchers found, that is when you ask individuals about how they feel about their school, they tend to feel good about their own school. So one of the things that we have to be more innovative about, and this is a huge area of growth for me, is like how we publicize ourselves and what we put out there about ourselves in the community to make sure that we are showing the impact that we have and the positive things that we have. Because most people, according to research, feel pretty good about like where their children go to school. It doesn't mean everybody does, and it doesn't mean there's not still problems and things that we need to work on, and we can't just kind of rest on those laurels. But I think there's got to be ways that we have to use technology better and things of that nature in order to really toot our own horn, which may then shift a little bit of that negative perspective. The thing that I think that would help overall with a lot of the pieces within education, and it's not innovative at all, I don't think, is really the idea of how we're using like project-based learning within the schools. And when I say that, I think of, for teachers, right, that idea of if they see what the kids are doing and they see that it makes a difference in it can really get teachers excited about teaching and learning, which is going to improve retention and support kind of what is going on in the school, right? Again, people don't go into education for the money. And again, people go in because they care about kids, because they're passionate about making a difference, and they're hoping to make enough money to raise a family. That's kind of what the hope is, right? So being excited about teaching and seeing the learning that's going on in your room, I think, is a big thing. I think with things like project-based learning can be a great way, because it really can be, as we talk about, like AI becoming part of who we are. That can be part of what we're doing, right? Gaming can be related to project-based learning. Makerspace stuff can be related to project-based learning. Science hands-on projects and, trial and error and hypothesis can all be part of that type of project-based learning. And again, you're getting students, if they're doing project-based learning correctly, really working together, right? Communicating, teamwork, teachers teaching, but teachers facilitating, coaching, kind of pushing students. And you're developing, I think those connections with kids overall, which I think if you're developing those relationships, that again helps with teacher retention. Again, if teachers are inspired by what they're doing, if teachers are building those relationships with kids, teachers feel better about what they're doing, they're coming back. We talk about things as far as classroom management and those issues. They become less when you have better relationships with kids, when kids are more engaged, when kids understand better what they're doing and how it might relate to real life and problem solving. When we went on our trip to Washington, D.C. This past year, one of the things that they were talking about with some of their schools, which I thought was interesting, and I don't know enough about it, honestly, but one of the things that they were reporting was some of the schools were working directly with places like Deloitte about actual problems and things that they're working on, or things that they see as actual problems, or hopefully development of things, and getting students to work on those types of projects in order to solve those problems and potentially create real world solutions, or working with those people throughout that process, which I think is great to expose kids to those ideas and that teamwork and that problem solving with real world stuff through kind of project-based learning. But I do think that does support getting teachers excited about teaching and learning, building relationships, which does improve retention.
And you feel like in your own experience, you've seen significant results specifically in the areas of math and reading when students are doing a lot of problem-based learning?
I would say that I don't know if I see enough of it consistently to feel like I can give you a great and accurate answer. I do think it offers those opportunities, right, to develop those problem-solving skills through math and science, to develop critical thinking skills, to support comprehension and reading. But I do think, when you look at, and again, state standards and curriculums, all those things are needed and necessary. I do think sometimes it can be a challenge to what it might look like with problem-based learning. I also think, again, teachers are stretched thin. It takes a lot to develop good project-based learning, right? And working through those, and how we can make them effective and adjust them to meet kind of what the kids' needs are and where they are. So it's not an easy thing to do. And so some of that is a bit of, how do we shift our lens? What are the curriculums we're bringing in that allow, opportunities for this? And then how do we connect it to what we're doing day to day? And then obviously outputs of standardized tests, and how we use those to kind of move forward with those. So I think it can be tricky. I don't know that I can say with confidence, hey, I think it does a wonderful job with these things, except for, some of the research that you read about hands-on learning and real world problem solving, and how kids do with that, and how it tends to, impact them positively overall. But personally, it's difficult to say that I don't know that I've seen it consistently enough across enough cases to feel good to say that in my own experience, it has this amazing impact. But I think it does, and I think it will. But I do think it's hard to tell, kind of with a lot of the other constraints that we have. Again, a lot of those are positive, and then a lot of them are there for positive reasons, but also can, make things a little bit more challenging sometimes. In time, that's a big piece with teachers, and if you're having to put in a lot of time to develop these project-based learning and really go in depth with them. It's on us too, right, as leaders to create those and support those innovations and really give teachers the tools to make sure they know how to do it.
Well, and you bring up something there too. People aren't talking about as much too of just the selection of the curriculum, right? And districts are adopting curriculum, and teachers are being required to teach curriculum that may not be conducive to problem-based learning, and it may not be beneficial for maybe actually seeing the gains in reading and math that they really want to see or think that the curriculum is going to bring. But so I've got one
whole different podcast, right?
That's a whole other podcast, right? Absolutely. We got more topics to unpack after this one. My last question for you is this, Dr. Younis, is that let's say that you're in your current district, you move to a different district, and the board has just appointed a brand new superintendent to your district, and you've got a few minutes to talk to that superintendent as they are taking that job, and they ask you, what do I need to know to be a successful superintendent? What are you going to tell that superintendent, that incoming superintendent,
Listen, you got to listen to your stakeholders. You got to listen to the community. You got to get a pulse of what's going on before you can make a lot of changes, right? And I know, like, when new principals come in, when new superintendents come in, I think there's this idea that there should be a ton of changes. And there are times where probably a lot of change is necessary. But I think if we don't accurately listen to the people, understand what the problems are, what the strengths are, and kind of get a good pulse. And again, you're really looking at, like, how do we triangulate the data? What other data pieces relate to the themes that I'm hearing from the stakeholders? And then at that point, people feel that they're valued. And so that as you begin to look at making these changes, and as you begin to assess how to go forward, people will be more likely also to be on board with you at that point and be more receptive to some of these changes, especially if you're able to articulate appropriately what the changes are, why you're making them, and then what is the goal behind them and what are the steps. But I think it's just important to listen when you come into any of these positions and really get to take some time to get to know your people, what is actually happening, and then really kind of go back and then assess kind of where we are and what we're doing. Without that, I think you are just kind of plowing full steam ahead without really enough knowledge. You also may find yourself with not a lot of followers because they don't necessarily feel like you're invested in them and they're what they feel like are the concerns of the district. And even if there are times where, again, it may not be exactly everything everyone said, if they feel heard, if they feel like you care, then they'll still follow you, right? And it may not always be what their concern is, but they'll begin to recognize that you have the best intentions for the community, the students, the families, the teachers, all the staff. And then you at that point can make a difference. So I really think that's a key piece in going in is you got to listen in order to understand what you're getting into before you can make changes and develop those relationships.
Yeah, that's great stuff. That could be a good commercial right there for the podcast. Listen. Well, Dr. Younis, this was really wonderful that you joined the podcast. I really appreciate it. Well, that was a great first episode, and I appreciate Dr. Matthew Younis being a part of it. And I hope as a listener that it helps you understand a little bit of what we're trying to do here with the Thriving Schoolhouse podcast. One thing I want to say is that as we think about teacher recruitment and retention, that's a hot topic. And I think sometimes we talk about, well, if we can get teachers to feel like they're connected and have relationships within the building, then they're going to be more likely to come back. And I think that part of that's true. People want to enjoy the place that they work, and they want to enjoy the school that they're in. But you know what else matters is personal health, money. Those are the things that people want too. And I unfortunately have seen teachers, administrators, people that were in my doctorate program who went through horrible things, health issues, relational struggles, because the stress of their job and the stress of working in education had such a negative impact on them. And so when those things happen, people say, I don't want to work as a teacher. I don't want to work as a principal. I don't want to do this because it's not worth it. And so when we think about teacher recruitment, we think about teacher retention, we also have to think about what are we doing to help mitigate those other things. And so one thing I'll suggest is I think teachers need to be able to have the opportunity to do action research projects or do writing so that they can potentially generate income on the side. And I'm going to go ahead and say this. The biggest solution that I can think of, and I will continue to talk about this in the Thriving Schoolhouse podcast, is that we go to a 4-day school week. And when I say a 4-day school week, if you go and take one day off of the school week, and let's say it's just Wednesday, and you say students aren't going to come in on Wednesday unless those students have a D or an F, maybe even a C in their classes. They've got to come into school on Wednesday and they've got to meet with their teacher and they got to do remediation and they got to do tutoring. And those are the only students that need to come in on Wednesdays. But if students aren't coming in, they can do enrichment activities, they can do remote work, they can do reading, and then that will give time for teachers to take a breath, to have a cup of coffee, to catch up on all the grading and all the professional development that they need, all of the things that they need to help them have a better work-life balance, have more margin in their life. And so when we really think about teacher recruitment and retention, we don't need people to just feel better. We need to have foundational shifts in how we do education. And that's why I'm a big proponent of the 4-day work week for teachers. But that is a long shot, but I'm going to keep talking about it on this podcast because I think it's really important. I hope that you enjoyed this first episode of the Thriving Schoolhouse podcast as we think about helping all students and achievement levels for all students. That's what this podcast is going to be about. And it is produced in collaboration with New Era superintendents who are doing whatever it takes to help students achieve in math and reading. Thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you on our next episode.